Okay, well, good afternoon. I'd like to welcome all and wish everyone viewing today a very happy new year and what I hope is a very inspiring and productive 2025 in regards to issues in our great nation of Canada. Why are we here today? Well, on Monday, January 20th, which is tomorrow, here in Powell River, our local MP, Rachel Blaney, is having a guest speaker come with her to the Powell River area. And this speaker is Miss Leah Gazan, who is here to talk about residential school denialists. With every story, we all know that there are two sides. And today we're going to talk about the other side and give some more information. So my name is Ted Vizzutti, and I've been asked, and it is my pleasure to be the moderator for today's discussion and educational event. At this time, I'd like to introduce today's three guests. First is Mr. Tom Flanagan. Tom Flanagan is a professor emeritus of political science at the University of Calgary. He is the author of many books and articles on Indigenous issues. Most recently, he is co-editor of the best-selling book, Grave Errors. Second today on our panel is Miss Michelle Stirling. Michelle Stirling is the producer, writer of The Bitter Roots of Sugarcane, a mini documentary which exposes the twisted history of the award-winning documentary Sugarcane. Some years ago, Michelle researched, wrote, and co-produced a number of historical shows about Southern Alberta under the supervision of Dr. Hugh Dempsey, this curator of the Glenbow Museum. This experience made Michelle into an Indian residential school factualist. Third today, we are proud to have Frances Widdowson. Dr. Frances Widdowson was wrongfully terminated from Mount Royal University in 2021, in part, because she challenged the idea that the residential schools were genocidal. She is the author and editor of fur books, often with Albert Howard, and is a contributor to the edited volume Grave Errors. Widdowson is currently producing documentary videos on the threats of academic freedom in Canada, is working on a manuscript called The Woke Academy, and is bringing Spectrum Street Francis, you're going to have to say that word. I can never get it. Epistemology to a number of university campuses. I, at this time, would like to congratulate Dr. Frances Widdowson on being the recipient of the George Jonas Freedom Award. This award recognizes her as a stalwart defender of free expression and academic freedom. Congratulations, Dr. Widdowson.
Yeah.
So at this time, we know why we're here, and we know who's going to be speaking. So what I'd like to ask first is Tom, I believe that we'll start with you, and we'll pass the mic over to you and give us some information.
Okay, well, I was asked to talk about the book Grave Error, and I'll do that. I'll tell a little bit about how the book came to be. Here it is, Grave Error. If you don't own a copy, you can order it while we're sitting here. Just key in Amazon, and Amazon will send it to you. So the book was brought into being by the announcement on May 27th, 2021 about the supposed unmarked graves of 215 children at Amazon, at Kamloops. I was already in contact with a group of people who had contributed to an earlier book, this book, From Truth Comes Reconciliation, which had been published before the Kamloops announcement. And I happen to know quite a few of the people that were represented in this book. So I was in sort of loose email contact. And when the Kamloops announcement came out, it's right here. Also worth buying. This is the first edition. There is now a second edition. Better to buy the second edition if you don't have the first one already. So when the Kamloops announcement came out, it didn't immediately strike me as a hoax. I spent my career studying Indigenous issues, but not particularly residential schools. So, somebody says, "Hey, we found all these graves." Well, I didn't know what to think. It didn't sound quite right, but on the other hand, I didn't have enough information to know it was a hoax. But I started discussing it with contributors to this earlier book, and some other people joined in, and pretty soon we had an email chat line of 20 people or so. And as we shared information, it became obvious that there was something gravely wrong with this Kamloops announcement, that it just did not add up. So I and a couple of others thought that we might write a book challenging Kamloops. But we didn't get very far with that project because it was too difficult to get agreement among the three co-authors. Too many different views. And so that project fell apart. But I still felt that a book was necessary because our group was writing about Kamloops and refuting it in various, mostly online sources that you might call alternative media. C2C, Western Standard, Dorchester Review, or others. But, these things get temporary attention, but and it's good that they then remain on the internet forever. But there's also something to be said for a book. It reaches a different type of audience and it gets into libraries. So instead of having a book co-written by three of us, Chris Champion and I came up with the idea of collecting the best work that was being done by our group and putting that between two covers. And some very excellent work was being done by people challenging not just the story about the unmarked graves, but related topics like, were Indian children forced to attend? Well, in fact, they weren't. Parental permission was required. Things like that. What was the quality of life in these schools? Were kids dying, in huge numbers? Were there all these missing children, et cetera, et cetera? So Chris Champion, who has a PhD in history, and I knew him from an earlier incarnation in politics, Chris and I decided to do an edited book. And so we got pulled together what we thought were the best essays by our group and a few other related people. And as a publisher, we ended up with True North. True North is a media news site, but it's not really a book publisher. I think they've only done one other book. But to be honest, conventional book publishers weren't interested in what we were doing. I had published, I think, 5 books with McGill Queen's University Press. Francis also had published there. But on this book, they just couldn't commit to it. It was too hot to handle. But our friends at True North had been interested in this issue right from the beginning. And they were very eager to publish the book. So it's a different kind of publishing that had ever been involved in before. We prepared them. We collected the works from our contributors. We did some editing, sent it to True North. They did another round of editing, and then they sent it to Amazon. And from there, it becomes print on demand. Amazon does the final polish, puts it into their computers, and then they have printing presses all over the world. And there you go. So Amazon then handles everything. They handle the printing, they handle the advertising on their website. They do sales. They ship it out. True North is not a book publisher as such, so it doesn't have the staff to do the conventional thing that book publishers do. Sending books out to bookshops, then taking returns. It's all quite labor intensive. So it's a very convenient arrangement. And the book has sold very well. I don't have exact numbers, but it's amazing how well the book has sold. And yet it has not had any notice in what we might call the legacy media. The only part of the legacy media that has paid any attention to the book at all is the National Post, which has published a couple of essays about it and had, it's been mentioned a few times. And yet we had, and I'm very proud of the people that contributed to the book. These are not unknown figures. There are several professors, retired mostly, history, political science, anthropology, education. There are several lawyers and a judge, journalists, a few amateurs, might call them, but mostly these were highly professional people who had made their career in the evaluation of factual claims, but ignored by the legacy media. But it was widely discussed in the alternative media, and also word of mouth. And then I'll tell the story about the Quesnel. You all, I'm sure, familiar with what happened in Quesnel in, when was that, last February, March, late winter, early spring. The Quesnel City Council ended up condemning the book, even though they all admitted that they hadn't read it. But they had come under pressure from local Indian bands. The mayor's wife, who had been his campaign manager, she was one of these people who knows everybody. She was a real estate agent and so on. She gave 10 copies of the book away. She liked it so well. And she gave a copy to a Métis fellow who gave it to somebody on the Indian Reserve. And anyway, they got upset about it. They came in, and there are several Indian reserves right around Quesnel, 3 or 4 reserves close by. So they all came in to a city council meeting, and they pressured the city council to condemn the book. Well, this was the best thing that ever happened for sales. For a week or two, we were Amazon's top selling book in Canada. We were selling better than celebrity autobiographies or how-to books or teenage novels or all categories. We were beating everybody, and it was because of the publicity from Quesnel. And that was the one time that we got into the media a bit, because local CBC and BC picked up the story, and then it created a couple of national CBC stories. So our sales just went through the roof. And so I was very disappointed in Powell River. I was hoping for another scandalous episode for Powell River to drive sales up again, but it didn't happen. Not sure what happened. Maybe Powell River people are too well behaved, or so. I'm not sure. Anyway, if we could get some more publicity, the legacy media sales would be even better than they are. But they have been very strong. But I guess we're limited in the impact that we have, because when a conventional book is published with an established publisher like Simon and Schuster or somebody like that, you get the book, but then you get a whole river of commentary surrounding it. You get interviews of the author, book tour, maybe. You get book reviews. You get attacks upon it and replies to the attack. So you end up reaching large numbers of people in this sort of secondary way. Whereas our book has reached a lot of people as readers and then through word of mouth to others, but we haven't had the benefit of the kind of publicity you get with an established publisher. So, there are limits to our reach. I think we've accomplished something. One indication of that is the CBC now generally doesn't produce stories about unmarked graves. They usually call them possible unmarked graves. That's a small step forward. But there still are a lot of stories being published, not just in the CBC, but throughout the legacy media. A lot of stories being published which contain statements that are blatantly false. They still repeat the canard that Indian children were forced to go to school and that there are thousands and thousands of missing children and so on. These things are palpably false. And if somebody had just picked up our book and read it, they would know that these are false. So we have a long way to go. The book is part of the effort. But our friends, we are continuing to publish in the alternative media. We have a website, the Indian Residential Schools Research Group, and the articles from the alternative media we usually post on our website. So what we do, what we can, and we promote the website on Twitter, and so we're doing what we can to influence hearts and minds. But it's a big job when you're facing a media monolith. We're facing the prime minister and the other politicians and the established CBC and the Globe and Mail and so forth. So it's a kind of an unequal struggle. But I guess we believe that in the end, truth will out. So we're doing our best. So at this point, I'm considering the possibility of maybe a follow-up book called More Grave Errors, because there have been lots of outrageous claims made in the wake of Kamloops. And I suppose most recently, the Sugarland hoax, which Michelle is more qualified to talk about, and I think you will be talking about that today. And that may get an Oscar. It's in the running for an Oscar for Best Documentary. And again, it's demonstrably false. So there's a whole lot of work still to be done. And I, as an academic, contributed in my own way with a book. But, Michelle's documentary is another approach, and alternative media and social media, and this kind of thing, responding. We've done some lobbying with MPs to try and make sure they didn't vote for any bill that would criminalize a different view about residential schools. And it looks like that won't happen in the short run, at least, not because our lobbying was so powerful, but because Parliament's been prorogued and then there'll be an election. So anyway, we're doing what we can, and the book is part of it. But I do think it is a kind of a basic source for anybody that's interested in this topic, and it's meant to be a factual treatment. And that's, of course, where the authors, we are factual people. We are retired active professors and lawyers and judges and so forth. So facts are what we cultivate. Okay, that's about enough from me. So let me turn it over to Michelle. I guess you're coming next, right?
Well, Tom, thank you very much. Yeah, we all know that the book has very good reading, and lots of people have read it. And if you're going on to volume 2, I think lots of people are going to be looking forward to reading that book as well, because there is still lots of historical moments and stories and factual stuff out there to be brought forward to the people of the world. So some of the stuff can be looked at and the truth can be found out for once and for all, hopefully. And hopefully that yourself and other authors of these books are not damaged in ways of being attacked the wrong way or anything, that people are just open to all the information they can possibly find out, because there's lots out there.
Yeah.
We saw signs in Paul River showing, 10,000 children are still missing. They haven't changed it. It still sits there and is quite visible here in town, and people go by it every day. So these are the things that, we all work towards trying to get the real truth of what is out there. And again, I want to thank you very much for being here today as one of our speakers, and great job. Really good
Well,
job.
Paul, if did I mention I have a title for the next book, More Grave Errors? So Paul River would definitely be a chapter in that, and of course Sugarland would be a chapter as well. So the new chapters keep emerging even as we speak.
Right.
New chapters are bringing themselves forward, so there's no end to it.
That's right. I think we all agree. So again, thank you, Tom. And we will get on to our second speaker, and that's we're going to bring in Michelle Stirling. Welcome, Michelle.
Thank you.
I'll give it to you, and away you go.
Okay. Well, I hope I'm sharing my screen.
I can see you.
Do you see my screen?
No, it just went up.
Here
Okay,
it comes. Yeah.
Yeah, there it is now.
Okay, very good. So, thank you all for joining us. I have quite a few slides here, so I'm going to go through them rather quickly, but Frances will be posting the PowerPoint on her website, so you can go back and check out the links or any of the details that you might not see as we go through. So Leah Gazan has made claims about Indian residential schools and about genocide. She's also made claims in relation to her own family. So I'm going to walk through an article that Nina Green wrote. She's an independent researcher, and I've just put it together into a PowerPoint and then added a few points toward the end. So like I said, I'll go rather quickly, but you can see the details later. So Leah Gazan misleads Canadians on her family and Indian residential schools. She wants to outlaw residential school denialism and make it equivalent to Holocaust denialism, a criminal offense. Why is Leah Gazan trying to put her fellow Canadians in jail? Did residential schools impact Leah Gazan's family? No. She said in one interview with CTV that this is personal, and then she replied to the interviewer, well, certainly, my family has been impacted by residential schools. Is that true? No. So let's look at her family tree. On her father's side, Leah Gazan's father is Jewish, Polish, and Dutch. Her father, Abraham Albert Gazan, and his parents and sister found refuge in Canada after the Holocaust. So no residential school there. No residential school impact on her mother's side. Her mother's side, she's of Chinese and Lakota descent. Her mother, Marjorie Lacane, was the daughter of Adeline Lacane and a Chinese father whose name is unknown. No residential school impact there. Maternal grandmother, Adeline Lacane. That leaves Adeline, who was the daughter of John Lacane, who in turn was the son of a Lakota woman, Tasunka Nupawin, also known as Emma Loves War. Was there residential school impact on Leah Gazan's maternal grandmother, Adeline's side of the family? Well, let's look at the historical record. So the Lakota seek refuge in Canada. Sitting Bull fled to Canada after the battle at Little Bighorn. And here is Emma Loves War, the great-great-grandmother of Leah Gazan. And Emma Loves War gives birth to Alice LeCain. Emma Loves War had an illegitimate daughter, Alice LeCain, by a white Northwest Mounted Police officer from Nova Scotia, William Edward Archibald LeCain. And succeeding members of the family took his name. And she gave birth to John LeCain after her relationship with William Edward Archibald LeCain and the birth of her illegitimate daughter, Alice. Emma Loves War had a son, Leah Gazan's great-grandfather, John LeCain. And she's also said to have married a Lakota husband named Okut about that time, but there's no record that we've found anyway. So non-status or half-breed were not allowed, technically, to attend Indian residential schools. But John LeCain technically was considered non-status and a half-breed, but he was allowed to go to Indian residential school. And both Emma's daughter Alice and son John attended the Regina Industrial School. Judging from his later accomplishments, he benefited greatly from the experience. John learned to read and write English. He became a writer and historian of his people. He learned carpentry, agricultural skills. He filed for a homestead. So, in fact, Leah Gazan's great-grandfather was a settler, as were other members of the LeCain family. Alice also had a successful life and died in the U.S. as Alice Matto in 1976. But John LeCain's children were not allowed to attend residential school. Although he managed to enroll Stella, and she was enrolled pending approval from the Department of Indian Affairs, the department rejected her application. Half-breeds and homesteaders were not allowed to attend. So Stella LeCain was forced to leave Qu'Appelle Indian Residential School. So it goes without saying that Adeline also was not allowed to attend such a school. So the impact on residential school on Leah Gazan's family was actually positive. So we see that the impact of residential school attendance on Leah Gazan's family was positive and not negative. John LeCain lived to the age of 74 and he was very capable. So just in case you're a bit confused about who's who, here's a quick family tree. You can see that people married a number of times. John LeCain married 3 times, so he was widowed twice. He is the one who went to Indian residential school. And when it comes to Leah Gazan's grandmother, Adeline, then Billy and Marjorie, who were the son and daughter of Adeline, were abandoned in a hotel room with a loaf of bread and a jar of peanut butter and one of jam. Marjorie, then 5 years old, contacted Children's Aid Society, and the children were put into foster care. Now, this is a matter of public record, what I just told you. Leah Gazan told this story to the House of Commons in September of 2023. But ironically, Canada gave Leah Gazan's family refuge, shelter, and success. So why is she tarring Canada with the term genocide, and why does she want to put fellow Canadians in jail? Leah Gazan's claims about her family and Indian residential schools are based on lies. So if we look at John LeCain's obituary, it says he was educated at an Indian residential school. He became interested in farming. He filed a homestead before the Sioux Reserve was formed. He was a talented writer of Indian folklore stories. Many manuscripts were awaiting publication in New York. He was an expert craftsman. His handicraft was much in demand. He was also a Catholic, very devout. He helped build and finance the church a mile and a half northeast of his home, which was built in 1946. And he also assisted visiting Catholic missionaries on numerous occasions, giving instruction in the faith to elder Indians who were later baptized. So you'd think that she would be grateful. And now Leah Gazan misleads Canadians in other ways. She's on the Warrior Life podcast, and she says, I come from a lot of diversity and genocides from different parts of the world, including Canada. Canada has a history of genocide denial, she says. And her premise of genocide in Canada is based on Article 2 of the UN Convention regarding the forcible removal of a child. But her mother was actually rescued by Children's Aid when, as a child, she called them for help after her mother abandoned her and her brother in a hotel. That's not genocide. And Gazan's reference to Article 2 of the UN Geneva Convention on Genocide does not apply to saving children from danger. And you can see also this quote here from J.R. Miller, who's a historian. This is his review of the Truth and Reconciliation Report. And he said, at no time in the history of residential schooling in Canada were parents compelled to send their children to residential schools. So this is the key point in this whole claim of genocide in Canada. Now, Gazan also said, what I love is human rights. What I love is justice, but justice is not served by falsely accusing Canada of genocide, for which no one has ever been charged or convicted of in Canada. So in fact, Leah Gazan is promoting hatred against an identifiable group, those who hold evidence-based dissenting views on Indian residential school genocide claims. So in this interview on CTV Power Play, she referred to Jim Keekstra, that he was punished for questioning the Holocaust. He was punished, but according to law now, this was 14 years from the time that Keekstra was dismissed from his teaching job, after 2 long trials, 3 sentences, 3 hearings in the Supreme Court of Canada, 6 trials and appeals in Alberta costing an estimated $1 million, an unrepentant Keekstra was sentenced to the equivalent of a tap on the wrist. Mostly because the courts recognized that even though his views were abominable, he had a right to freedom of expression. And the difference between the Holocaust in Europe and the claim of Indian residential school genocide in Canada is very significant. The Jewish Holocaust, wherein the Nazis intentionally murdered 4 to 6 million European Jews, is confirmed by evidence, including documents from the Nazi files, which meticulously noted names, numbers, dates, and origin of those murdered or incarcerated. The Holocaust also meant that about another 6 million people considered undesirable by the Nazi regime were similarly murdered with intention, such as gays, Roma, the disabled, mentally handicapped, and persons holding dissenting views. And also there was an international tribunal held post-World War II, the Nuremberg trials. So there was a whole legal process, evidence-based, and the term genocide was adopted by the UN on December 9th, 1948. And there's no such equivalent evidence supporting the claim that there was a genocide at Indian residential schools in Canada, nor have there ever been any such charges, nor has there ever been such a. So Leah Gazan is dividing society and driving dangerous incitement with such claims. Senator Bayak was wrongfully dismissed, and Leah Gazan's family benefited from Indian residential schools. I hope you'll watch our previous Zoom session where we debunked Sean Carlton. Leah Gazan's claim that there was no help for Indigenous women in the 40s is also incorrect. And Leah Gazan is committing mischief and public incitement of hatred with her false claims and with Bill C-413. In fact, Leah Gazan's father was Children's Aid Services Director involved in adopting out Indigenous children who were deemed to be at risk in Winnipeg.
Oh,
And Leah Gazan told the House of Commons her own mother was saved from a destitute, dysfunctional home in about 1941. Well, there are some references here to similar situations in the 1960s scoop, just to give you some insight into why sometimes children were apprehended. Alan Higgs, a former social worker in Saskatchewan, said, I never ran across a parent who said, I hate my children. You keep them. I recall they all said they loved their children. They wanted their children home, but booze had become their master. And yes, he scooped children. Here's why. These are some kind of brutal references, but these are his words. Received word from parents who hadn't been seen in several days. Go to the house. No heat, no firewood. What little food is frozen. Crying baby on the floor. Her wet diaper frozen to the floor. Police insist I accompany them at 3 in the morning to a rural area. Arrive to find a drunken orgy with children under 10 present. Minus 35 degrees Celsius. They patrol down the back alley near the beer parlors and find carfuls of kids who are hungry and cold. After midnight at their own home, there's banging on the door. Small children arrive saying, Mister, come and help. There's blood all over. Arrive at the house. Blood and beer everywhere. Walls, ceiling, floor. Crib upside down. Baby screaming. And a young woman and boyfriend having intercourse in a room. So Canadians are right to question the residential school genocide and mass graves claims. Historical evidence does not support the claim of genocide nor clandestine mass graves in Canada. So like there probably are, we know that there are some mass graves from epidemics, but that's not clandestine burial. To date, there's also no list of names of missing children who disappeared, and there are no missing persons reports that are unresolved. I hope that you will watch my mini documentary rebutting sugarcane. It's sugarcane, not Sugarland, because this BC First Nations chief says that Indian residential school victims may have been incinerated. So that's why there's no evidence. You'll see why that's a false claim. And we will have Q&A after Francis, so please keep the comments civil. Ask questions rather than making long comments. And thank you very much for joining us to discuss this important topic and to engage in public debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Wow, very informative. Lots of good information. I don't know how anybody can dispute what you've just said. It will definitely be interesting to hear what Leah Gazan has to say tomorrow, Monday night, when she's here in Paul River.
Yeah,
and
Monday.
It'll be interesting to ask her some of these questions if we can, and see how she answers them. Tom, go ahead.
Francis?
I think Tom had his finger up.
You're muted, Tom. Sorry, Tom, did you want to say something?
He's got his...
No, you're muted on your...
Unmute. Just one point, Michelle, to strengthen what you said. You pointed out that, was it John LeCain, and he was Leah's great-grandfather, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. He homesteaded.
Yeah.
Well, Indians were not allowed to homestead under the legislation. So her great-grandfather was not legally regarded as an Indian at the time, and if he was allowed to homestead. I mean, the government checked these things very carefully.
Mm-hmm.
So, the Indians had their land on reserves, but they could not homestead in other lands. So that just reinforces what you were saying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's all thanks to Nina Green did that research.
Yeah, no, she's a tireless worker.
That's excellent. I have a quick question for you, Michelle. Why was Leah Gazan picked to represent this residential school denialism? How did she get put into that position?
It's a good question. I don't know, other than that I think she's the NDP MP for Winnipeg Centre. There's a lot of Indigenous people there. The National Truth and Reconciliation Centre is being set up at the University of Manitoba. So, it's very important that nobody counter this, because it's a multi-million-dollar project and lots of jobs. Not to
Okay.
mention all the millions of dollars going for grave digging across Canada. Over to you, Francis.
Very true. All right. Well, thank you again, Michelle. We're on to our third speaker now. Dr. Francis Widdowson is with us. And Francis, take it away.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Ted, for the introduction. And thank you, Tom and Michelle, for your presentations. What I wanted to do is look at the backdrop with respect to this accusation of residential school denialism within the university system, something that I have very, very close knowledge of, personal knowledge, and just generally observing what's been happening in the universities since the Truth and Reconciliation report came out in 2015. And Leah Gazan, people might not know this, but Leah Gazan, I believe, was elected in 2018. But before Gazan was an MP, she was a lecturer at, I believe, first Red River College, and then she was at the University of Winnipeg. So Leah Gazan, for a number of years, is connected to the university and college systems, which could explain to some extent why she has developed this path in terms of taking on this area of what's called residential school denialism. But I wanted to stress that I believe that the university system and what's going on in the university system has a direct effect on the kinds of accusations that people like Leah Gazan, not to mention just bringing up the Powell River case, Haggis, John Hackett. That's what started the name change debate in Powell River, was that Hackett kind of absorbed many of the arguments that were being made by people like Sean Carlton, who is one of the main people who have been involved in the accusation of residential school denialism. So what I wanted to do is, first of all, give you the definition from Sean Carlton as to what residential school denialism is. And I just accept Sean Carlton's definition of that and then apply it to the various claims that are being made by people like Leah Gazan. And then Leah Gazan's efforts at trying to criminalize residential school denialism. And then I want to talk more generally about the university system and residential school denialism accusations. And then the case that pertains to me, which is the case of Mount Royal University and what happened there. And finally, I just wanted to say a few words on this idea that we're supposed to be having truth before we can have reconciliation, and how damaging these accusations of residential school denialism are for searching for the truth and trying to develop a better understanding of the residential school system. So in terms of residential school denialism, this was from one of the earliest pieces by Sean Carlton, along with Daniel Heath Justice, on this subject. And in this piece, which was written in August 2021, residential school denialism was defined as the rejection or misrepresentation of basic facts about residential schooling to undermine truth and reconciliation efforts. So when people are talking about residential school denialism, one of the things that should be asked is, how is this person or this book misrepresenting basic facts about residential schooling? And in this article by Carlton and Heath Justice, and this is in the lower left-hand corner of the screen, they talk about recent announcements of unmarked children's graves across the country, and that's got a hyperlink on it. And if you click on that hyperlink, you get into an article which talks about the discovery of unmarked graves near the former residential school site in Kamloops, BC. So if we're going to be talking about the misrepresentation of basic facts, this is a misrepresentation of basic facts. Because as we know now, in July 15th, 2021, the ground penetrating radar expert hired by the Kamloops Band said there were no unmarked graves discovered. What we had were anomalies or targets of interest on the GPR, and it was only through excavations that we could determine whether these were actually unmarked graves or not. So here we have Sean Carlton, who is the main accuser of many people for being residential school denialists, who appears in this piece to actually be the residential school denialist because he is misrepresenting basic facts about the residential school. So this is the kind of thing that constantly happens, is that there are these accusations when it is the people who are making the accusations who are actually guilty of what they are accusing others of doing. Leah Gazan, who we have mentioned, who Michelle did a very, very interesting presentation about the kinds of misrepresentations she's doing with respect to her family. But the biggest problem with Gazan is not that she is saying all these incorrect things, which, you know, many people do, although she's a politician, so she should be a bit more careful with what she's saying. The big problem is that she wants to criminalize what she calls residential school denialism. And there's two reasons that she gives as to why this should occur. The first is that she argues that that people who are making these claims, these residential school denialists, are making cruel, harmful, and hateful types of remarks. The cruel and harmful side, you know, this is hard. This is very subjective because, you know, saying that there's 215, there's no 215 unmarked graves in Kamloops could be seen by some to be cruel or harmful, but hateful, it's up to Gazan to show how contesting claims about the residential schools is a form of hate. And she's never done that. She just makes this accusation. And in order for something to meet the bar of hate speech, it has to open up a group, a protected ground, so it's usually race or sex or so on, to detestation and vilification. And the Supreme Court has ruled on this, and I believe the most recent decision is Ward, the case of the comedian Mike Ward. And what you have to do is you have to be making arguments such as this group should be cast out of society and should have no protections under the law. Those kinds of claims. And I have no way, I have no understanding. I can't figure this out, actually, what their arguments are as to contesting arguments. How can this rise to this level of detestation and vilification? It just seems to be an absurd claim. So that's the one side. And then the other is that, you know, these ideas are false. So these false ideas, so we should be criminalizing false ideas. And everyone, I hope, can see the danger of that, is because whether an idea is false or not is determined through open discussion, debate, and the weighing of evidence. And if you're going to criminalize ideas, then you're going to cut off that process, which I think is the intention of this whole criminalization process. Leah Gazan, again, on October 31st, 2024, had a press conference that she held with Kimberly Murray, who's on the right-hand side there. She is the special interlocutor who's making all sorts of false claims about disappeared and missing children. And as Thomas said in his presentation, there's no evidence for missing children. What we have is people who don't know where they're, for example, Tanya Talaga, who's a journalist, supposed journalist working for the Globe and Mail, who I would argue is an activist, not a journalist. She was looking for where her great grandmother Annie was buried. And Annie was in an asylum and was buried in a cemetery that now has been abandoned. So there's no markers anymore. It's beside the Gardiner Expressway. So Tanya Talaga was trying to find out where her grandmother was buried. That's the kind of thing we're talking about. Not like Argentina, where people are looking for their relatives who have been murdered and buried in clandestine graves. So this is a completely different issue. In this press conference, Leah Gazan singled out the book Grave Error as an example of residential school denialism because, according to her, it is engaged in the willful promotion of disinformation and the mass dissemination of hate. And Gazan has not provided any evidence for either of these accusations. Not one piece of evidence about the disinformation or the mass dissemination of hate. This is incredibly irresponsible for a politician to be doing this, and for Rachel Blaney to be inviting this incredibly irresponsible person to be coming to Pell River is shocking. And just because of residential school denialism is about spreading misinformation and so on, or perhaps disinformation, one only has to look to the posting that Gazan made on June 9th, 2021 on her website, where all sorts of misinformation was provided. First of all, by Gazan herself, saying that 215 bodies were found at the former site of the Kamloops Indian Residential School. But then she cites 3 Indigenous leaders who not only say that bodies were found, but they were found in a mass grave and they were murdered. This is something that Gazan posted on her website on June 9th, 2021. And someone should ask Gazan if she still stands by those claims, and if she doesn't, why hasn't she made a public apology and a retraction of those claims? So that's Gazan, who, as I mentioned, has linkages to academia because she was a lecturer for a number of years before she became an MP. But what I want to get across is that the reason why Gazan is so confident in making the claims that she is making is because there's a whole academic infrastructure that is behind her. And the most vocal professors who have been engaged in making these accusations are Sean Carlton, who people are probably very well aware of because he came to Pell River almost a year ago. But there's also Negan Sinclair, who's the son of Murray Sinclair, who's at the University of Manitoba, Keisha Supernant, who's at the University of Alberta, and Ian Mosby and Pamela Palmater, who are at what used to be called Ryerson University and is now called Toronto Metropolitan University. It's no longer called Ryerson University because Ryerson was a well-loved person who was involved in Indigenous education in the 1800s and is deemed now to be someone who must be canceled because the sound of his name is upsetting to a number of Indigenous activists. But anyway, in terms of this is an important question because it's about misrepresentation of basic facts. That's what we're seeing residential school denialists as being. Well, starting off, Sean Carlton and Ian Mosby in May and June 2021 were making arguments about a mass grave being found at Kamloops. And this is very odd because Sean Carlton, as Michelle mentioned in her debunking Sean Carlton video last month, he's taking issue with people zeroing in on the fact that the media referred to mass graves. He's saying that this is just a big hoax that people who are taking issue with this are making, that it was just a minor thing which was being discussed in the media. Well, this doesn't consider that a lot of the media outlets went back and corrected their articles. But also, why is Carlton zeroing in on this when he is one of the figures who was involved in spreading this idea of a mass grave being found at Kamloops? What other things have these accusers of residential school denialism been saying about this? Well, Keisha Supernant, she argues that the residential school system was genocidal. What evidence does she use to support that? Well, the government has unanimously recognized that the residential schools were genocidal. Are we supposed to believe everything that the government says? This doesn't seem to be a very good piece of evidence that she's using. Negon Sinclair, after Michelle's, very thorough kind of comparison of the Holocaust and the residential schools, is making the comparison between residential school denialism and Holocaust denial. I find that incredibly offensive for him to be doing that. And of course, Sean Carlton is celebrating it. That's the other thing to notice, is that these professors all support one another's work and congratulate one another all the time. Negon Sinclair, another source that he uses is the Pope. So, all the claims about virgin birth and so on, we should just accept that because the Pope says this is the case. And then finally, Sean Carlton, right after the announcement was made in May 2021, was saying that the community had a feeling. So that's the community's feelings about things that we should use as evidence to support our understanding of the residential schools. So I think the kinds of evidence that these academics are using is not at a high standard. And that's what we have to be looking at, is what kind of evidence are you using? How reliable is that evidence? And things like what the government says, what the Pope says, the feelings of the communities, making ad hominem remarks where you're comparing people making, evidence-based arguments on the residential schools with Holocaust denial is the kind of evidence that's being presented. And then finally, we've got Pamela Palmater. And I highly recommend listening to this podcast, both with Sean Carlton and Leah Gazan. It's embarrassing. These people are not serious academics, and they just accuse Tom, Flanagan, and me of being racist and so on without any evidence. If you're going to take your colleagues to task for being incompetent or being immoral and so on, at least provide some evidence which you're going to use to show how that's the case. They don't do that at all. So that's the kind of level that we're looking at with respect to these podcasts. Okay, so that is the general academic tone that exists out there that has made Leah Gazan so confident in making these irresponsible accusations. Then we have the case of Mount Royal University. And as Ted was introducing me, I was wrongfully terminated. So an arbitrator this last year found me to have been wrongfully terminated. One of the reasons why I was terminated was because of my views on the residential schools, which sort of created a poisonous environment, which allowed me to be pushed out. For people who don't know this, Sean Carlton was a professor at Mount Royal until June 2020. I see the poisonous environment that existed there as being partially due to Carlton's influence at Mount Royal University, but there was also a number of other factors, such as the September 2020 declaration that the residential schools were genocidal, made in General Faculty's Council, the academic body for the entire university. And then, of course, Tim Raleigh's 221 state announcement of the discovery of 25 innocent children found in unmarked graves at Kamloops. That is still on MRU's website. It's never been retracted. And that just shows you the kind of pressures that were being put on professors at MRU, which resulted in me being pushed out in December 20th, 2021. An interesting backstory to all of that was a professor by the name of Gabrielle Weaselhead. She went by the name of her married name of Gabrielle Lindstrom at that time. She was very upset about the arguments I was making about the residential schools, resigned in December 2020, saying that she could not be at Mount Royal anymore because I made Mount Royal unsafe by the claims that I was making. After I was fired 3 months after, in April 2022, Gabrielle Lindstrom was rehired at Mount Royal University, Gabrielle Weaselhead, as she is now called. So connect the dots on that one. I think it's not hard to do. And Weaselhead and Travis Hay have both made presentations on residential school denialism in 2024. Weaselhead was very upset about me having the book Grave Error on the table when I was listening to her presentation. And Travis Hay basically called Tom Flanagan and me racists at his presentation. And that slide up at the top right-hand corner, that was one of the slides from his lecture. I have that on my website along with a transcript and recording of his talk. He did not look at any work that Tom and I had done on the residential schools in this presentation, in a presentation that was accusing us of being residential school denialists. And then finally, Keisha Supernaut was invited as a distinguished arts speaker in November 2024. There was no question and answer period, no open question and answer period from the floor. So that gives you a sense of how the information about the residential schools is being controlled at Mount Royal University. And this is, although this is one university, I don't think it is that out of the ordinary in terms of the climate that exists at universities, which basically first ridicules people who are making claims that counter the existing genocidal, the idea of the residential schools being genocidal. Then you're ostracized. You find that you can't really be allowed on committees anymore. And then finally you're pushed out. And this happened to me directly because of comments that I made in the Western Standard that the residential schools gave Indigenous children an education that they wouldn't have received otherwise. This resulted in the Students Association and other people putting forth a form letter for people to fill out. And this is an interesting one on the left-hand side. You'll see there's a blank. I think it is my duty blank, a member of the public, faculty member, student. This was just submitted without filling in the person's name. So these form letters were being submitted. As a result of that, on the right-hand side, this is my termination letter, part of my termination letter, where it says that the reason why my employment relationship is no longer viable is because students have raised numerous complaints and concerns about your views. This is just a terrible precedent for universities to be saying if a whole bunch of people complain about you, you should be fired, because obviously this can be completely unsubstantiated and unwarranted complaints that are made, and it makes it very difficult for people who are making contentious arguments in the university. The final thing I wanted to point out is universities historically have been known as truth-seeking institutions. If we're going to be talking about it's necessary to have the truth before we can have reconciliation, the whole truth-seeking mission of universities is being knocked out on a number of issues, but on the residential schools is what we're talking about today. And this is being due to prescribed doctrines being imposed about the residential schools, specifically the residential schools being genocidal. That is a prescribed doctrine, a predetermined conclusion that must be reached at the universities. And what that does is it causes what's called the false consensus effect, which is a known fallacy whereby people think everyone believes something and therefore they're reluctant to challenge it because, why wouldn't it be true if everyone's saying that it is in fact true? That's what's happening in universities. There's also a great deal of intimidation, and I would argue that the accusation of residential school denialism is in fact an attempt to intimidate people, to make it seem like they are beyond the pale if they challenge often nonsensical views about the residential schools. And the result is all sorts of forms of censorship, institutional censorship. The most, the least pernicious being, limiting the questions that people can ask at an event or not allowing questions at all. The worst being the firing of a tenured professor, which is the most extreme. And this is being enabled as well because of this idea that there's different conceptions of truth. And Ronald Neeson, a book that Michelle referred to, this came up in his book, where it's argued that Indigenous leaders have a different conception of truth than the truth that prevailed in universities that are based upon Enlightenment principles. And that is, if an Indigenous person believes something to be true, it should be accepted as being true. And the idea of believing survivors is the idea that it is this subjective belief that should be accepted as being universally true, which is at the heart of that demand. And then in universities, what we used to have is a bunch of scaffolding that made it possible for professors to challenge contentious ideas. The tenure, the protection of tenure, which is completely gone now, as we see in my case, because if people complain about you, you can be dismissed, which tenure is supposed to protect you from that. And then finally, all the disconfirmation processes, the kinds of question asking processes that used to be encouraged in universities, and now you are going to be charged with harassment if you ask questions that are upsetting to Indigenous scholar activists that exist in the university. And that's what happened in my case at Mount Royal University. Thank you very much. I look forward to any questions that you have.
Thank you, Francis. That was, again, very inspiring. Lots of good information. And you're right. There is a lot of people out there that are afraid to have any say. So having our three panelists here today, we know that the truth is out there, and that's what we're looking for, and that's what we're trying to get out to everybody, so they're not afraid to come forth and say their half to find out what the truth is. Now, I know that I've been watching the side comments, and there's been a couple of questions. Most are quite easy. There hasn't been many. One is in regards to and I take it this might go towards Michelle, but any of you could probably answer it. And it's in regards to the genocide, Truth and Reconciliation invokes subtitle powerful psychological and this is from Leah Gazan, let's say that she's saying this kind of information. Have they been called on this type of information coming out at people?
Do you mean that, like, has Leah Gazan been called on it?
Yeah, like has somebody come back at her and said, where are you coming from? What information are you getting?
I don't think so. Only people like us, a handful of people, and it's really, you would think that in the media, that would be the first question to someone making such claims, that they would say, well, when was the genocide hearing? Like, when was Canada or any Canadian official or Catholic priest hauled up before the International Criminal Court of Justice? When was the hearing? When was the conviction? Because if we don't have any of that due process, then, as you know, under the UN Charter and under Canadian law, you are innocent until proven guilty. So what has happened is it's just a media narrative that's spun out of control. And I think because people were in such shock about the notion of these unmarked mass graves, and so many children, some of the media reports even said children as young as 3. And the first announcement said human remains, so it conjures up these horrific images. I think that none of the parliamentarians were willing to challenge that because they'd seen what happened to Lynn Beyak. So they didn't want to get Beyacked either. And probably, I mean, when I first heard it, I thought, yes, they probably did find a mass grave. But I said to myself, probably one from Spanish flu epidemic. So one half of that story is potentially credible and believable and perhaps even true. We know there are 3 mass graves at Blue Quills, formerly Saddle Lake. It's all from typhus epidemics. So these graves may exist, but that doesn't mean nefarious things happened. So I think and when she presented this motion in the House, she wanted to describe Indian residential schools as genocide. Well, since it's been passed, now it's that they declared it was a genocide. They switched the language a little bit.
Okay, that's great. Hopefully that question came from a gentleman, Mark Crawford, and he has another question. And I'm not sure if Mark's on with us at this time. If you are, Mark, unmute your thing and ask your question to the panel.
Yeah. Oh, thanks. Hi.
Hi.
I wanted to ask Frances for a clarification on her dismissal. My understanding is that there's no hope of you getting reinstated through the courts because of the judicial deference to labor arbitrators in labor law. But I was just wondering, did you appeal to the Labor Relations Board? Is there a possibility for reinstatement through the Labor Relations Board, or is that basically not possible?
It is being appealed. So the case is being appealed. I've heard April 2025. That's when they're expecting it to go forward. The big problem, however, is the union. And I'm currently involved in actions dealing with the union because although my lack of reinstatement is being appealed, what's not being appealed is the findings of harassment, which for me is the most significant issue because what's happening is a lot of people at Mount Royal are claiming that I should not be allowed back because I was found to be engaged in harassment, when what it was satirical tweets comparing the residential school, the idea that the residential schools were genocidal with the Holocaust and things like that. So no one 5 minutes ago would have found anything like that to have been harassment. But because of the whole equity, diversity, and inclusion activism that's taken over the universities, harassment has been redefined to be if you demean the viewpoints of a protected group, that's harassment. So that's what my major focus is on now is going to the Labor Relations Board and trying to get the appeal to be more robust than it currently is. But it is going forward on the reinstatement question to the Labor Relations Board.
Is that new definition of harassment, is that the technical language, or is that your paraphrasing of it? I mean,
that is Jeff Hope. So what I'm taking it from is, see, the arbitrator never made any findings of fact about harassment. I think it was completely incompetent, that report. But what he did is he accepted all the findings of the investigators that MRU had hired, which were 4 investigators. Those 4 investigators all had contradictory understandings of harassment. So we were looking to the arbitrator as the neutral overseer to make a finding as to what harassment was, and he did not do that. And so that is a shocking thing. After hundreds of thousands of dollars were probably paid for that report and that process, to not get the finding on what harassment actually is totally unacceptable.
Well, that's interesting. Thank you. I have a second question, but maybe I'll just wait for somebody else to ask a question first.
Okay, that'd be great, Tom or Mark, and I'll try to remember to come back to you on that one.
Okay.
Thanks very much. We do have another question from Diane Sparks from Paul River. Diane, go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Ted. Great to see everybody today, by the way. This has been super interesting. Love it. I can't wait for this to be recorded and it get plastered all over social media. So, but my question I have is for Tom. Tom, with this new book that you're going to consider, will you have a chapter in there about the Pine Creek First Nations?
Oh, for sure.
In Manitoba? Sure. I certainly hope so, because that is the story that is continuously being buried. And I keep bringing it up and trying to get it on social media, sending the video of it. Like, I mean, that is probably the best case of evidence that we have thus far, proving that the GPR is unfounded. And there, oh, so the anomalies, yeah. So then the chief of Napanack, I think it was, in Manitoba, the chief said, okay, well, now we've got the anomalies. Now let's excavate them. And they found donut hole. They found nothing, right? They found some broken clay pieces and some clay rocks and some rocks, and no, they found nothing. So I don't understand why that. I don't know if you've looked into it at all, but it just astounds me why that this information hasn't come out more, and why the government isn't finally going to say, okay, well, they excavated there with the anomalies that they had from the GPR. Maybe we should do that at Kamloops. Why isn't anything being done? I don't get it. Who's holding this back? Who's stopping it? Do you know?
Well, I think so. I think, you see, the Pine Creek was the only case of excavation at a residential school, which was not also excavating in a cemetery. This was in the basement of the church. So it's a good test case. It was not a cemetery. As you say, they excavated and they found nothing. So I think that's a message to all the other activists that, no, we better not excavate. It's too risky. So they can make far more mileage with GPR or some other techniques of finding soil anomalies, which might conceivably be graves, but nobody knows until you test them, and then to act as if they were graves. And the government is not calling them on this, that they're still letting the money flow. So I think Pine Creek means that we won't see any more excavations because it was so clear, like absolutely nothing was found. So you've got the money pipeline working for you. Are you going to jeopardize it by actually excavating? So what the money is being spent on is a combination of collecting oral histories, going back over documents, but unfortunately that work is not being done by qualified historians. It's being done by amateurs. And then pushing around GPR. So they gather all kinds of information except the one kind of information that would actually prove or disprove a claim. So it's like a perpetual motion machine. Of course, you'll find more soil anomalies. Canada, most of the soil is rocky, and it's often been disturbed by construction and lumbering and all kinds of things. So it's not hard to find soil anomalies. So then you claim that this is evidence that kids are buried there, but you never do the critical test. So until people wake up in government, wake up and say this is basically fraudulent, it will continue. Even though you're right, Diane, it shouldn't. I mean, the Pine Creek should have, been a huge stop sign.
Yeah.
But it seems to have had no effect. It got reported, and then things went on as usual everywhere else. Yeah. It's an indication of how low the intellectual level is of our government officials and our politicians, that they don't react to that.
I know. It's disgraceful.
It is.
I think that everybody understands that reconciliation is not just about trying to fix all the things. There's a lot of other issues involved with reconciliation. And to get that, we need to find the proper truth. We all understand that one as well. Reconciliation right now is a large thing to do with money. So Diane's question, you're part of that as well. And I thank you for that question. At this time, we also have another gentleman that has a question that we'd like to bring in. Mr. Arnold, I'm not sure if you're hearing me, but go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, thanks very much. And thanks, Professor Widdowson and other presenters. Perhaps to build on Tom's point around kind of the political discourse, now that we're, coming up to an election, I was wondering if you had any thoughts on how this discourse might shift, or the role that this issue could be, the role that it might play in the election, or ways in which during kind of the upheaval that may come during the political, transition, if this is something that may also be addressed.
Well, it won't play any role in the election because the Conservatives, would be the only ones who might conceivably raise it, but they are following what's known as the small target strategy. They have identified a few major issues that they think they can win on: inflation, housing, this deficit spending, and so forth. And they want to confine discussion to that. So you won't find Pierre Poilievre raising this. It's because we got the advice from Australia. They said, you raise these issues, the minority groups will come at you like a swarm of buzzing hornets. Don't raise them. So the best you can hope for is something will happen after the election, but I would have no hope at all that this discussion will be aired during the election campaign.
Michelle, go ahead.
I'd just like to mention that we could make an issue of it because Mark Carney, who is possibly a shoo-in for the Liberal Party leadership, his father, Robert Carney, was a very esteemed Canadian historian and a professor at the U of A, and has written a number of pieces that support Indian residential schools as their original objective. He wrote a critique of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People, wherein he showed that, a lot of the residential schools were actually accepting orphans, the dying, the disabled, even adults coming there looking for help. So that tells us two things, I think. One, that there may be people buried in graves near these schools or at the local mission grave that are unidentified. So let's say you were a traveler, a transient worker at the time, got sick or injured, came to the school for help, and unfortunately you died. You would have been buried there. And, people were not walking around with a social insurance number back then. A lot of people never had ID of any kind on them. So, that would raise the question of, yes, there are these unmarked graves and unknown people, but they might have come there for charitable assistance in distress. The other thing he pointed out is that this was a home for orphans. This was a place where people got help. This was a social service medical hub, and did a lot of good for the broader community. So actually, this journalist the other day was asking me, well, wouldn't Robert Carney be called a residential school denialist today? And I said, yes, he would be. So I think that might be a very good lever to bring up his father with Mark Carney. It's very curious that such a famous Catholic has not said a word about all the churches being burned down. Like, I'm not a Catholic, but I am opposed to any religious facility being damaged, burned down, vandalized. It's wrong. So, and he hasn't said a word. Now he wants to be the prime minister.
Yeah, but he won't. His communications advisors will tell him to not go anywhere near that topic during the campaign.
But he won't, but we can.
We can, but during a campaign, how much traction do we get? Because the news. I don't know if this is a bit of a digression, but if anybody saw the print edition of the National Post today, big picture of Mark Carney looking like he just stepped out of central casting to be the prime minister. That picture is worth $10 million of free advertising. And yet the National Post is opposed to Carney by and large in their coverage.
Right.
But he is so photogenic. So, we could write about it, but I don't think we have much chance of breaking through, breaking through the mainstream coverage that's going to take place. Anyway, I'm always known as a pessimist.
Francis, you had your hand up.
Yeah, so I think it's going to be, if people are thinking that conservatives are going to take this on, they are very much mistaken. Polyev, first of all, voted along with everyone else for the residential schools being genocidal and so on. As well, he made an embarrassing, groveling thing about the horrors of the residential schools on one of the anniversaries. So if he tries to enter into this, he's going to get hit with his record, and that's going to be very embarrassing for him. So I don't think he's going to want to go anywhere near that.
Yeah, he won't.
It's quite interesting because Pierre Polyev was just in Powell River last week, and I presented him with a Powell River Forever shirt, and he came right out and asked, "How's the battle going in regards to the name change?" He knew about it, so he is well aware of some ideas of what's going on in Powell River in regards to.
But what Pierre will want to emphasize, if he does talk about Indigenous issues, is giving assistance to First Nations who want to get involved in things like building pipelines, power plants, mines, stuff like that. There's the loan guarantees are the new big idea, and Pierre is in that direction. So he will claim that yes, he wants to help Indigenous people, and this is how he's going to do it. But he won't have any interest in reopening this debate. Now, if he's in power, he may well turn down the money tab. That's quite possible. He's got to do something with the enormous deficits that he's inheriting. He may quietly turn down the money tab for the Indians, but he won't campaign on that.
No, and that's the political side of everything. So a lot of comments that I've been watching on the side here is in regards to Leah Gazan and percentages of what she might be for Indigenous background, and lots of people have been coming up with 50% to 25% to 12.5%, and it all comes back down to her mother was this and her father was this. Michelle, can you have any say on this now?
I can't say anything authoritatively because today I was reading a PowerPoint presentation that was actually written by Nina Green, or most of it was. So I'm not familiar with all of the details here, but Joan Robson has posted that that Adeline was the daughter born in 1910 of John LeCain and Florence Cote. And so Leah Gazan has some Lakota and some Cree. And then she later posted that all of John LeCain's wives were Indigenous. Florence Cote was Cree. Helen Tabiaka Santee was apparently Indigenous. Christina La Suisse Santee died in 1992. She outlived him. So then Leah Gazan's mother or grandmother was a daughter of those, and her mother was part Chinese and part Lakota and obviously part white because John LeCain was quote unquote a half-breed. So someone would have to do all the genealogical math. I'm not good at that.
Yeah, I don't think we'll ever get the real truths on what percentages are what.
Well, we can if we get the birth certificates and death certificates, and I think that maybe maybe Nina has those, the birth certificates.
Right. Somewhere in the world, there's paperwork somewhere. There's a comment here, and I'll say it at this point, and then we can get Diane Sparks back on. She has another question. Here's a comment. Funny thing, Clawman Band, which is near the Paul River city, had unmarked graves and did a GPR in 2020. 217 were unmarked. They placed big crosses on the graves after that. Even hereditary chiefs didn't have crosses. So many places of a wood stake will fall apart and disappear, and or you just don't know who is there. In this case, we know that their area is theirs. So go ahead.
And one comment also, we have a number of death certificates of children who died at Indian residential schools. The number stated in the Truth and Reconciliation of children who died at the school was 423, which is sad, but also over the course of more than 100 years and 140 odd schools, it's not a very high percentage. But most of those death certificates show that the child their body was sent home for burial on reserve. So, a lot of times they're digging in these community graveyards that formerly were attached to the mission, which was the first thing there. So the graveyard is probably full of my relatives, not theirs, ironically.
Correct. All right. Well, we'll get another question. Diane Sparks, are you still on?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Hi. Thanks. I have a question. This is for the whole panel. I'd like to get everyone's ideas and opinions on this. I have discussed this with Francis with regards to pursuing a Canada-wide legal petition that we could present to the House of Commons regarding the excavation of the anomalies. And what I want to do is try and get, it's going to have to be a bit of a group effort. Want to get little snippets of everybody's opinions and evidence. And I want to try and get this petition and do it legally. Like Francis and I found the website and the government website for doing a legal petition, and do a legal petition and get it to go viral Canada-wide. See if we can get 1 million signatures and get somebody's attention. I mean, even if the Conservative government does get in, which we hope they do, because a change is as good as a rest. But so hoping that they do get in. But maybe if we do this petition, maybe they'll listen and they'll actually do something. How can they, or maybe we should try and get this petition out before we vote to put the pressure on them. I don't know. What's your opinions?
I think the petition has value just as a consciousness raising. I don't think it will. The big problem, it will have an effect in terms of getting people to think about it and say, why aren't we doing this? And why is this still 4 years later? Is nothing happening about this? And as well, which is part of the petition, would be part of the petition is the report, the GPR report supposed report by Sarah Bollier, who was the expert hired by the band, is that she was paid $40,000 to do this report or to do this GPR survey. So why have we not been able to see the methodology that she used in this report? And there's some skepticism as to whether the report even exists. No one, we just have the word of the SFU archaeology department that there is some report that was reviewed by 5 archaeologists. So I think it would have, if we could get a lot of signatures on the petition and publicize the number of signatures, then it would have that effect of putting pressure. But in the end, because of, and Tom probably knows more about this than me, but I think with the legal status of Indigenous groups and so on, it's very difficult to force them to do this themselves, and to get the RCMP. It really should be the RCMP that takes over and does it. But the RCMP, we've had lots of discussions about this on our research group, that the RCMP has basically decided that there's nothing to investigate, because what do we have? We have a couple of, stories that are circulating. So, the RCMP doesn't go up and dig up every single thing that someone says they think that there's people buried in my backyard or something. They say, well, why do you think that? And say, oh, well, there's some story that, Kevin Annett was, talking about. So it's actually it makes sense that the RCMP wouldn't be investigating because there's no evidence. But the question is, why do we continue to have this kind of, the Kamloops band cordoning off their apple orchard, saying this is a sacred site and all these kinds of things. So I think it would be useful as a way to raise awareness about the situation, but I don't think it will have any effect in terms of action.
I think in today's world, to have a successful petition, and I don't mean successful in necessarily forcing change, but petition that attracts notice, it has to be sponsored by an organization that has a large email distribution list. You have to be able to reach out to a couple of 100,000 people to collect signatures. So, somebody like Rebel News, maybe True North, Canadian Taxpayers Federation, these are organizations that have large multi-100,000 distribution lists. If we could get one of those interested, it might be worth considering. But I think that's the first hurdle you have to get over is some reach to contact a fairly large number of people.
There are definitely news places out there. You're right. One that covered my story, the New Westminster Times, they have a large following, and again with Rebel News and the Dorchester and all of those types of places. Those are the ones that we have. We all know that places like the Suns, Vancouver, Calgary, any place that has a Sun paper, you may not get both sides of the coverage. So that's one of the issues that we are fighting today's.
Mm-hmm.
Michelle or Francis, did you guys have anything else that you wanted to say in regards to Diane?
I just put a note in the chat. I wrote an article called My Sacred Quest for a Class Action Suit on behalf of non-Indigenous Canadians. So that might give people ideas, because I think that we have to go beyond a petition and get some legal action going. But you can read all about it there. I won't go on about it here.
I agree. It's hard to do as well, just to try to find that lawyer nowadays that's willing to go against the system that's in place. It's very it's mixed up out there in the world right now.
Yeah.
I just wanted
Mark.
I just had a follow-up, Michelle. I think that the thing to stress too is not about non-Indigenous Canadians, but this is also very harmful for Indigenous people to have this happening, to have all this money spent on the Keisha Supernonts and the lawyers and all the Aboriginal industry that siphons money away from the Indigenous communities, the things that are actually needed, like the housing and education and healthcare and so on. So any kind of initiative that's undertaken to get answers about this situation should keep that in mind, that it is very, very harmful to the marginalized Indigenous people who are not getting any of this, the money that's circulating for all these searches and everything that's going on.
Michelle?
I would agree with you. And I think the problem is that the reserves are very, very small, 500 people or less in many cases. I think the biggest is about 12,000 for one of the Six Nations or something like that. So it's a very nepotistic small community, and those people would be unlikely to be willing to speak up because they might suffer consequences. But I agree with you that it is very harmful to ordinary Indigenous people who are living, 15 people to a house while these other characters are flying off to conferences around the world.
Yeah, I'll agree with that, Michelle. I know in my case, when I talked to a gentleman that I've known for many, many years and who is an Indigenous, and asked him if he would write me something, he says, I can't do it. He says, if the group of 6 or 8 in their band were to find out, and these are the 6 or 8 that is doing the damage in Powell River, they would come after this family. And I totally agreed. And I just went, yeah, no problem. And I think that still happens right across Canada, that there's a small group in each band that is doing the damage and is affecting the rest, and the rest don't have say.
Yeah.
Mark Crawford, if you're still on, you had another question to ask.
Yes. I feel like I need to know, do we have a comprehensive statement of who the Indigenous knowledge keepers are? I mean, specifically in Kamloops, but also elsewhere. And I've heard Francis talk about Billy, who I think a child psychologist would say is just recalling a bad dream he had when he was 6 years old. And another person who was disreputable. And I've heard references to a bunch of people just jumping on the 215 number, who have billions of dollars of compensation money, who see billions of dollars of compensation money out there, sort of jumping at that. But what I want to know is, I mean, if you have a comprehensive statement of who the Indigenous knowledge keepers are, does it include anybody who reasonably claims to have seen something or heard something? I mean, particularly somebody who maybe heard or said something before the Indigenous industry took off in the late 80s. I mean, is there anybody like that in the Kamloops situation or in other situations that we can talk about? And in relation to that, I want to say I'm kind of attracted to the idea that there could be 4 or 5 people who heard something or saw something, because that would be consistent with the number 14 of people we don't know where they are, the number 10 of the 52 who died, who we don't know or we're not sure exactly where they're buried. In other words, and even with Keisha Supernant saying, I saw, some curved, in the Scientific American article, she said, I saw something curved or bean shaped in the X-ray, in the X-rays or the ground
GPR.
penetrating radar scans, and I'm saying maybe she's not lying, but I bet you $100 that she did not see more than 10 or 20 of them, right? I mean, if there are 4 or 5 people who plausibly claim to have heard something or seen something, it could be burying people, like Michelle said, just people happen to be there. But anyway, that's where I'm heading. That's why I asked the question, is there a comprehensive statement of who the Indigenous knowledge keepers in this case are?
No, it's always referenced in vague terms. Our knowledge keepers tell us, and then they will trot out somebody. I've done what I hope is a careful study of Kamloops, and nobody was making these claims in public before the Kamloops announcement. After the Kamloops announcement, a number of members of the tribe then started to say, well, they saw children hanging from meat hooks, or they saw babies thrown in the incinerator and so forth. But nobody made this type of claim in public with any record before 2020. What was it? 2021. It's all contaminated evidence. You get the outrageous statement by the leadership of the band, and then they have all these contaminated witnesses who say, yeah, I heard this, I heard that. But nobody's been identified as on the record of having said, I was aware of these burials before the announcement was made. So, yeah, as far as I'm concerned, the so-called appeal to the knowledge keeper is basically worthless. We don't know who these people are. They're not named in advance. They're not on the record going back in time. Yeah, it's basically worthless as far as I'm concerned, from a historical point of view.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Michelle.
Yes, with regard to that, I think people should watch Sugarcane. It's streaming on Disney Plus now. And I think Disney Plus is about $16, $17 a month. You can cancel once you've seen it. But in this, as you say, 3 or 4 people coming up with the same thing, they have a few people that they interview in the film. And, this kind of personal testimonial is quite compelling. Usually the people are quite emotional. One fellow in Sugarcane claims to have seen a nun with a shoebox and the baby fell out and then she threw it in the furnace and they, uh, you know, it sounds horrific. But when the reporters asked Emily Cassie, the producer and director of the film, about, could they talk with this fellow? She said, well, he was really damaged by this. He lives in a remote location off grid. He's really in trouble. Well, he's a lifelong alcoholic. And even when they started interviewing him, he said, look, I'm shaking already just talking with you about this. So, I mean, theoretically, sure, any of these things could have happened, but there's no evidence for it. And so we have all these people repeating these stories. So I think if you watch my mini documentary rebutting Sugarcane, you'll see.
Okay, great. Francis, go ahead.
So with respect to the Kamloops case, there are 2 eyewitness accounts. Billy Coombs, as Mark Crawford mentioned, and Jesse Jules. Billy Coombs's testimony does exist because it was in the film Unrepentant that was produced by Kevin Annett. So there is an interview with Billy Coombs where he said he saw he was discussing a child being buried in the Kamloops apple orchard. Jesse Jules's testimony is more graphic and more personal, like eyewitness account type of testimony, but we have never been able to locate Jesse Jules, and it's always through the eyes of Kevin Annett, the Jesse Jules testimony. There were knowledge keepers that Nina Green did uncover on the Kamloops website. One of them being Mona Jules is one of the knowledge keepers, and she testified at the Sarah Bollier presentation on July 15th. But I don't think she has ever had any testimony about bodies being buried. It's more her kind of impressions that she has had about it. So it's all very, very murky, all the kinds of claims. And Tom is quite correct that there was a number of people who never said anything about it. I believe it's Eddie Jules is one of the people who was interviewed in an interview a number of years ago, never said anything about the burials. And then all of a sudden, after the Kamloops announcement, he started making these claims. And there's a number of cases of that. So this is all now, but there never were any really compelling accounts before the Kamloops announcement of burials. And as Mark Crawford said, Billy Coombs is the person who said that Queen Elizabeth had abducted the 10 children from the Kamloops Indian Residential School. It's known that Queen Elizabeth wasn't in Kamloops at that year. And even if Queen Elizabeth were in Kamloops at that year, no one can be expected to believe that with all the coverage Queen Elizabeth gets when she goes on her various, trips, that she would have been able to go and take time out to go abduct 10 children that no one would ever have known about. Like this is the kind of stories. I sort of see that sort of story as the same as the 200 children being buried. It doesn't have any credibility to it. And the whole thing as well, just to think about what it takes to actually clandestinely bury someone, to suggest that in that busy site close to Kamloops, that in the middle of the night there was all this going on, that just is not, it's not credible. I think the whole thing is just totally not plausible as to what's being argued. And I don't think, I think it should be sort of seen as the kind of ghost tales and everything that it likely is.
I think that there is some element of truth, as there often is in things that get spiraled out of order, in that, remember, many of these children were orphaned, so that means that they would have been exposed to death before coming to the Indian residential school, whether they were at a graveside ceremony for their parents or caregiver. They might have witnessed the person actually dying in front of them, especially in the time of TB, and usually when people died of TB, they had a huge coughing fit and spewed blood all over the room. So, it was pretty ghastly. So if you were a young child exposed to that kind of thing, or even just the trauma of loss, of sudden loss like that, you can understand that then being thrown into this very unexpected environment, not being able to say goodbye to your loved ones, losing all your familiar surroundings, you'd experience that as a tremendous loss. And it would, over time, with all the telling of these other tales, you could easily adopt these things. And there's an American psychologist who consulted on a satanic panic in Saskatchewan. And he said that, with a bit of prompting in the leading questions, people can remember all kinds of things that never happened. And if you look at the Maclean's article about Tony Merchant, since before 2006, all these ambulance chasing law firms in Canada have been sending out client questionnaires trying to get clients for their class action claims with forms that are saying, well, where were you penetrated? How many times? Who did it? What other horrible things did they do? So they've been actually putting ideas in people's heads, and people got money for those ideas. And obviously, some of the people were deserving of that compensation, and others just, filled in the blanks and they ended up getting money. So there's an incentive, a known incentive in this relatively small community that this pays. I'm sorry to put it that way, but I'll put the Tony Merchant article in the links here.
I don't think you're far off, Michelle. I think a lot of people have ideas that money is driving a lot of things. We're coming up to 4 o'clock here. I'm not sure how much longer we want to keep going, but we do have one more question for Francis, and that's from Diane. Diane, give us a question since we're coming up, on time.
Yeah, Francis, because somebody else brought this up with regards. Maybe you can define the terminology knowledge keepers, because somebody brought up a good point on here that it just kind of, is it a term the Indigenous came up? Why does everybody keep saying knowledge keepers? Why don't we just say something like, that was what they remember, or that's what they think, or that's their opinion? Why do we keep giving them more credibility by calling them knowledge keepers?
Whenever I use the term, I put it in ironic quotation marks, because first of all, knowledge is not kept. That's not how knowledge arises, and to say knowledge is kept is kind of a religious kind of concept, because it's the idea that it's a custodian of some kind of sacred type of idea, and that's really what's being talked about. but I don't think the term is serious at all. And I think I did see a comment, maybe it was Trevor who put it in the chat, that it's a way of giving some idea legitimacy that doesn't really have any substance to it, because now it's got this aura of, ooh, it's a knowledge keeper who said this, when it's not a very valid idea that's being put forward. In terms of who is considered to be a knowledge keeper in the Indigenous community, that is a very interesting question in its own right, and it's a political type of it's a political process that determines this. So someone who's in a has a close connection to the leadership is going to be seen to be a knowledge keeper, whereas someone who's unpopular and doesn't have connections won't be seen as a knowledge keeper. So it doesn't have any validity at all. It's an absurd idea to begin with, and then it's used for political purposes to get people to accept ideas that they would not accept unless it had a knowledge keeper label on it. And as well, there's a bit of a hidden coercive character to it. If you have someone who's paraded in front of you as a knowledge keeper, to contest what that person says is seen as being inappropriate. Like, a knowledge keeper is not supposed to be challenged, because that's why they have that designation. And if you challenge them, you will definitely get some glaring eyes directed at you. And that's kind of what the whole thing is all about. So I think it's bullshit, and I don't accept it at all.
Francis, I don't think I ever heard the term until the Kamloops announcement. Have you ever looked at the history of the term?
Yes.
And when it started to appear?
Yes, I have. And it's in the traditional knowledge literature.
It is, huh?
And Albert Howard and I, when we were doing our first work on traditional knowledge in 1996, that term was brought up in the Broken Hill property diamond mine environmental assessment. And if you were a knowledge keeper, you would get honoraria and so on, and have your views being, given a certain amount of legitimacy in all this research that was being done by these consultants to get contracts from Broken Hill properties to put in their reports and so on. So it's got a long, it started in around, I guess, I don't know if Broken Hill properties BHP diamond mine hearings was the first instance of it, but it was around that time that it started with the traditional knowledge types of contracts, where it started being credibility.
Okay, thank you.
Well, everybody, I think we've done a great job here. The information has been incredible. The people that have sent in information on the side that we've all been reading has been great. I think lots of people are going to go away from this with more information. And that's what we're all about, right? We're trying to get all the truth out there.
How do we, Ted, sorry, question. How do we access some of this information that was posted in the meeting chat after we've finished with this? How do we access this stuff?
Well, you can take a copy of the chat. If you just do cut and paste the chat, I've taken some, because I don't have time to read everything. I've just posted it.
I took a cut and paste of the whole chat, so I can send it to you, and then you can post it if you want, or send it by email.
If people have written things that
that they don't want to have out there.
I don't know. I don't know if you guys, if that's your view, but anyway, if you're concerned about what you've written in the chat, send me an email, and I will. I know that's often not seen as being public, but
gotcha.
But anyway, we've got cut and paste of the chat. Michelle, my presentation is on the wokeacademy.info site. I'm going to post Michelle's presentation on the wokeacademy.info site. And after this is over, I will be uploading this event onto my YouTube channel, and I will make that available in the next half hour or so.
Oh, okay. Great.
Well, that's great. I think lots of people will be looking for it, and we can spread the word that it's out there. Again, thank you, the three of you, for coming out today and presenting your side and information to everybody. I'm not sure what else we want to do other than wait for the next time that we all get together and pass on some more good information in regards to residential school denialism, more information regarding Leah Gazan, who again is in Powell River tomorrow to say her
Monday,
side.
Monday, Ted.
Monday.
Oh, what's
Monday.
today?
Monday. Yeah,
Monday.
today's Saturday.
Monday.
So Monday. But Sunday, I'd like to, I hope to see all the Powell Riverites at the beer and burger night at the Carlson Club.
And for anyone
Good
who's
job,
going
there,
to
guys.
Leah Gazan's and Rachel Blaney's event on Monday, we
Monday.
seriously need a recording of that event because we want to be able to respond to everything that is being argued. I have no idea what they're going to argue at that event, but I'm sure the name of Tom Flanagan and Francis Widdowson and maybe Michelle Stirling and a bunch of other people are going to be mentioned. And those people, for their comments, should be held to account for what they say. And the only way we're going to do that is with a recording.
It's all great for sales.
Anyway,
Yeah.
thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
We're
Buy
hoping
the
to do
book.
other events like this. Thank you very much, Ted, for agreeing to moderate today. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Tom and Michelle, for your very interesting presentations.
And thank you, Francis, for putting
Thanks,
this all
Francis.
together. Yeah,
Mhm.
thank you,
Mhm.
Francis.
Till next
Okay.
time.
Good job.
Okay.
Till
Bye-bye.
next time.